All right, our final topic for the trimester, for week 4, the interval of a half step. So this is a really helpful diagram for you to remember. This is what we call 2 peaks and a valley, and then 3 peaks and a valley. It's just a display of all of our, here's a major scale starting from C, going to C. Remember, these circles that are not filled in represent the white keys on the piano. So as long as you remember that there is a set of natural half steps between E and F and between B and C, this is going to be really easy for you to remember. So the reason we say these are natural half steps, E and F and B and C, is because there is no peak in between these 2 notes, no peak in between these 2 notes. We have the dots filled in up top to represent the black keys on the keyboard, on the piano. So anytime you see that dot filled in up top, that means that there is the interval of a half step between these 2 pitches beneath them. So what we are going to eventually do is be able to figure out how many half steps there are between two different notes, and also we're going to be able to figure out enharmonic tones. So just to give you a reminder, enharmonic tones means that we have a sound, we have a similar sound, the same sound, but it can be spelled differently. It can be spelled 2 ways. So let's try this out. So we're going to start with C. Remember, if we want to raise a note, we add a sharp to it because a sharp raises a note by a half step. So if we take C, raise it by a half step, we get C sharp. Same thing with D. If we want to raise D by a half step, we call it D sharp. We got to skip E for now. F, if we want to raise that by a half step, we call that F sharp. If we want to raise G by a half step, we call it G sharp. And if we want to raise A by a half step, we call it A sharp. Now we're going to do the same thing going backwards. If we want to lower a note, we have to add a flat to it. Flats lower a note by a half step. So I'm going to skip C for now, and we're going to start with B. So if we take B and lower it, we call it B flat. If we take A and lower it, we call it A flat. If we take G and lower it, G flat. E and lower it, E flat. And D and lower it, and we get D flat. So what we find is at these tops, at these peaks here, we have 2 different notes, but we have the same sound. Hence, the definition is the same sound, but a different spelling. So an enharmonic tone of C sharp is D flat. C sharp, D flat, enharmonic tones. So every line segment that we see here from point to point, from C up to C sharp, that's the distance of 1 half step. From C sharp up to D, that's the distance of a half step. So every segment along the way is a half step. Okay? Let's talk about E and F. We can still call them by other names. We don't see them as common, but we can still do it. So we take E and raise E by a half step. We call it most commonly F. But by using a sharp, which raises a note a half step, we can also call E up a half step E sharp. Similarly, we can take B and raise B by a half step, and we most commonly call it C, but we can also call it B sharp. So, B sharp and C are enharmonic tones. E sharp and F are enharmonic tones. Let's do the same thing with C and applying our flat to that. So we take C, lower C by a half step, we most commonly call it B, but we can also call it C flat. We can take F, lower it by a half step, we call it most commonly E, but we can also call it F flat. So, those are the rules of the half steps. This diagram is going to be super helpful for you to remember. Now, let's talk about finding half steps. Some of the questions that you might see on a test would be, how many half steps do we have, for instance, from D up to F sharp? So we got to start at D. But remember, D by itself is not a half step. It's not a half step until we travel from one note to the next note a half step away. So D up a half step is D sharp. So that line segment is 1. D sharp up to E is 2. E up to F is 3. F up to F sharp is 4. So therefore, we get 4 half steps from D up to F sharp. Let's try another one. Here's our next question. How many half steps from B down to D flat? Okay, so let's find our starting pitch. There's B. Remember, B by itself is not a half step until we travel down a half step. So B down to B flat, that distance right there, that segment is 1. B flat down to A is 2. A to A flat is 3. A flat to G is 4. Down to G flat is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So we got a total of 10 half steps. One thing that's really helpful too, and might minimize some confusion, is when you go down, call them by their flat names, and when you go up, call them by their sharp names. All right, so those are half steps and harmonic tones, and that should hopefully give a pretty good summary of that lesson. All right, see you next time.